So just a couple of introductions. I'm Paul Hannam. I'm co-chair of Greening Stenning. I've been involved in environment for over 25 years in various capacities. I do green books with my colleague Joanne Knowles, whose idea it was, prompted by Muswell Hill Green Books. So we're very pleased to have you join us. And a bit about Greening Stenning, for those of you who don't know where we are. So Stenning, Bramber and Upper Beeding is a community on the South Downs, down in Sussex, about 5 or 6 miles north of Shoreham. Beautiful part of the world. And we have a very active, thriving green movement here. And we have over 1,000 people, supporters on our list, which for a small, town is really quite extraordinary. And we have 100 volunteers. We're active in 4 main areas, in transport, in biodiversity, in green energy, home energy and lifestyle, things like recycling, food, waste. And we've got lots of exciting projects happening at the moment. And we've just been promoting 20-mile-an-hour speed limit here. And Dawn on the call's been very proactive in that. And we're doing a lot of nature mapping. We're doing protecting verges so that the council don't cut them to have more pollinators. And lots of local projects. We're also looking at some bigger projects like community energy. And we'd love for you, especially those of you who live nearby, to come and visit us. We'll be at the farmers market. We've got a stall on Saturday and you can meet me and my colleagues and learn much more about what we're doing. So these are exciting times. I'd like to thank our friends at Stenning Bookshop who are offering Rob's book at 15% off. And they've been very supportive of our work, Sarah and Robin, so big thank you to them. So let's get started. I think most of you will know Rob, but a brief introduction. We're absolutely delighted to have him because he's a very important person within the environmental movement. He is, as I'm sure you know, the co-founder of the Transition Town Topness and the Transition Network, and the author of the Transition Handbook, the Transition Companion, The Power of Just Doing Stuff, and his latest book, From What Is to What If. In 2012, he was voted one of the Independent's top 100 environmentalists and was on Nesta and the Observer's list of Britain's 50 new radicals. And I love talking with radicals because that's what we need. We need a lot more radical people at the moment. He lives in Devon, near Totnes in Dartington, near the Schumacher College, which is a beautiful place. I spent quite a bit of time at. Very well worth going, one of our leading centres for environmental studies in the UK. He lives with his wife and 4 children, has particular passions for cob building and walnut trees. And you did tell me about your art, Rob. Just remind me of what you've just done today.
Oh, I do lino prints, and for the first time in my life, I have some work in an exhibition in Kingsbridge. So if any of you happen to be in Kingsbridge over the next couple of weeks, drop into Harbour House and marvel. That's
a true Renaissance man who is interested. That's wonderful. And we'll be looking at the confluence, I'm sure, of culture and environment and society. And The Guardian said about his last book, what we're talking about, big ideas that might just save the world. And we're going to be talking about that and the community. So a very big warm welcome to Rob. And Rob, perhaps first of all, you can tell us about your book, why you wrote it, what the big idea was, and how it sort of came from your other books. How did it evolve from that?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming along. I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, I found myself reading loads of people who I really admire, like Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben and people, George Monbiot and Amitav Ghosh and people and this phrase, climate change is a failure of the imagination, kept coming up. It was in David Wallace Wells' Uninhabitable Earth book. It just kept coming at me from different directions. And David Fleming, who some of you might know, who wrote Lean Logic, who was quite a sort of a mentor to me, I guess, in the early days of transition. The book Lean Logic that he had been writing most of his life and never managed to get published while he was alive was finally edited and published. And I really recommend. It's extraordinary. And in there he says, if we are to see a sequel to the market economy, it will above all be a work of the imagination. And so when I kept reading all these people saying climate change is a failure of the imagination, it got me thinking, why? Like, because then they would just go off and start talking about something else, right? They would just, they would just throw that into the mix and carry. I was left there going, uh, why would we be having a failure of the imagination in 2021? Is that a thing? And if so, why? And what might we do about it? So I started digging around and I found this research that was published in about 2010 by a researcher in the US who used this big data set from a creativity test that went back as far as the 60s. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ had risen together till the mid 90s, at which point IQ had kept rising and imagination had started to decline. And then she had seen that trend continue. And when it was published, it made the front page of Newsweek. It was a really big story. Said people said, "Well, what does this mean for America? What does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar?" But I never heard anybody in the climate change, social justice movement say, "What does this mean for us?" Because you cannot build what you cannot imagine. And so I then basically took a sort of a sabbatical from working for a transition network for a couple of years and really threw myself into this question, are we experiencing at the time when, as Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left? Are we really living in a time when our imagination, which needs to be charged like a superpower, needs to be a kind of a muscle where in our organizations, in our movements, in our governments, people are like, right, okay, well, that obviously isn't working. Let's start again and reimagine some other stuff. If that's not happening, why is that not happening? Because I feel like we recognize that if a population doesn't get a good enough diet, we're going to see a rise in preventable illness. If you don't have a good education system, the population is going to fail to reach its potential. But somewhere just sort of over there, out of eyeshot, our collective imagination is kind of desiccating and shrinking and eroding, and no one's drawing any attention to that. And perhaps if that gets beyond a certain point, it's a really, really dangerous situation at the very time when our survival depends on us being able to reimagine and rebuild everything. So that was really the journey. And I spent a couple of years doing it. I interviewed more than 100 people, most of whom I hadn't heard of before the whole thing started. And and it's been fascinating. Yeah. And hopefully, if any of you read the book, you found it useful.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm reminded of the famous Einstein quote that you can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness that created it. And when you talk about imagination, you're looking at that sort of very profound shift at a sort of cultural, societal level, or is it more around practical imagination in terms of being like a Silicon Valley for green technology, or is it a combination of, how are you defining imagination in that sense?
My favorite definition of imagination is that it's the ability to see things as if they could. The ability to see things as if they could, which feels like something we so desperately need. I'm reading a great book at the moment by a woman called Mariame Kaba, who's a phenomenal prison abolitionist campaigner in America, called "We Do This Till We Free Us." And in there, she says we live in a system that is locked into a false sense of inevitability. Where the people in the Ministry of Defense making the space to have the conversations about what does a peaceful world look like and how do we get there? Where are the people in the Department of Justice actively having the conversations about what would a very different kind of justice system look like? If that space isn't created, those conversations never happen.
What do you attribute this failure of imagination to? Do you think there's a particular root cause, or are there multiple reasons?
I think it's like it's a kind of a perfect storm of factors, I think. And there was one writer who I thought was great who used this term of the Trump disimagination machine a little while ago. I think it's different things. So that research, she said it was due to the decline of play, of that sort of free, unstructured, let's pretend sort of play, which has almost disappeared off our streets and largely disappeared out of many children's lives, I think now, to our huge detriment. The rise of screens, and there's a whole chapter in the book about the degree to which the devices that we carry around in our pockets kind of devour that space, which is where we should be being imaginative, because imagine being bored is basically your imagination calling to you, and we can choose to either respond to that, or it gets overridden by by those devices. And she also said it was due to the rise of testing in education. I think there are some things that we can add to that. I think it's clear that spending more time outdoors, collectively we spend less and less time in nature, and the research about the impact of austerity and inequality and the rise of anxiety, and the fact that we have an economy which sort of thrives on it functions by creating anxiety and depression and loneliness. And the more unequal a society becomes, the less we create the conditions for people to be really imaginative. There was also some really fascinating and very troubling research I found that suggested that the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the effect on our brain is that of sort of shutting down our ability to be really creative. And it was the first time I'd really felt that sort of boiling frog in a pan of water thing in relation to the imagination. So there's lots of different things that I talk about in the book. I think those are probably the main ones.
Is it also a decline in attention? You referred to the impact of our digital life, and at the moment, and a lot of work I do in psychological work is about digital detox, is about getting away from the screen. Because as you say, for most people, we have our best ideas not sitting at a computer, but in the shower or going for a walk or playing, as you say. And, what can we do as individuals, as communities, to rediscover that spontaneity and creative mindset?
Yeah, well, if I may, I might just read
Please.
3 paragraphs out of the book, which actually are how the chapter on attention opens. And often when I give talks with people, like actual people in a room on a stage, actually I kind of get up and sort of act this out, but I'll just read it as it is. Imagine, if you will, Vincent van Gogh in Arles, France, in August 1888. It's a late summer's day with the Mistral winds blowing through the street outside. He's just got back to his small studio in what he calls the Yellow House, which he dreams one day will become home to a community of artists. He's carrying with him a bunch of sunflowers, a gift from his friend, the gardener, Patience Escalier, whose portrait he completed a few days earlier. He arranges them loosely in a glazed earthenware pot on a plain wooden table. And instead of what history tells us happens next, imagine he were to sit down, get out his smartphone, and check his Instagram feed for updates. Soon he's checking his Facebook timeline and his Twitter account, and before he knows it, an hour has passed and he finds himself on YouTube watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. Thus distracted, his attention is taken firmly away from the possibility of really seeing those sunflowers, of immersing himself in their shapes, forms, and colors, the way the light plays on them, and how he emotionally relates to them. Forever lost to generations would be the resultant paintings which have so moved, fascinated, and entranced generations ever since. What if, for that matter, Albert Einstein had stayed inside, posting Instagram photos of his breakfast rather than taking long, dreamy bike rides? Or if William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy had been checking their social media accounts while they walked straight past that famous host of golden daffodils at Glencoyne Bay in Ullswater in the Lake District in 1802? Or if Mikhail Bulgakov had been a YouTube star instead of writing The Master and Margarita? What might we have lost? More to the point, what works of inspired genius might we be losing right now at a moment we're in dire need of as much inspired genius as we can summon? As Sherry Turkle from Massachusetts Institute of Technology puts it, we are forever elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and for me, I feel like the link between attention and imagination is essential. And there's I really recommend by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows, about what happens to a society as it loses its attention span. And he talks about it beautifully. He says when you live in a culture that has a good attention span, you are able to dive deep into knowledge. And that's where you get wisdom in a culture. But when you don't have a sufficient attention span, it's more like you just sort of water ski across the surface. And a guy called Sven Burkitz, who I think is amazing, who I interviewed for the book and also for the podcast that I do, he said, we are losing the very paradigm of depth. And I feel like, actually, you know, in relation to the climate emergency and the ecological emergency, it's profoundly important.
Yeah.
Because we need to bring our attention to this, and we're just distracted and all over the place and pinging from thing to thing, and all the while this emergency grows and grows in its complexity and its severity.
I remember the book by, I think, Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I thought was a very apt metaphor for our society. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, really. So how can we stimulate our imagination? What ideas or best practices have you seen where people are sort of taking a stand against this?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So the first thing is we have to recognize the imagination needs space, and we need to design that space into our organizations, into our movements, into the things that we do, into our lives as much as we are able to, because so, you know, things like Extinction Rebellion, the transition movement, I think have been really good at saying, just creating a culture as groups where you don't just meet as colleagues with an agenda to crack through. You meet as people who care about each other and who make space to bring all of you who are, and you start with a check-in, and you make space for celebration and for grief and for whatever needs to be looked at in that space. So creating space, I think we have to look at something like a universal basic income or a 4-day working week as being national imagination strategies, because they give people space. And you mentioned earlier the first lockdown. I mean, for me, that was what was so extraordinary. We saw an experiment in what happens when people have some space. And people, I'm going to write the great novel I've always wanted to write, and doing online art classes and dance videos with their family and starting gardens and all sorts of stuff. So space, places, I think we have to recognize the power of places, even small places. There's various stories in the book, places that you go to, and afterwards, when you go back to where you came from, you don't see their possibilities in the same way again. And it could be somewhere like Center for Alternative Technology. It could be places that are really great examples of transition. It could be kind of pop-up things where people take a space and transform it over a week or so. It could be like when Extinction Rebellion occupied Waterloo Bridge and turned it into a forest for 2 weeks, which had a profound impact on so many people who saw and experienced that. The third one is practices. You know, we need things that we can do together. I think imagination, yeah, we can cultivate our own imagination, and that stuff really matters. But the most important thing is imagination as a shared collective activity, and designing the ways for that. So, you know, transition groups, other groups are great at sort of holding these kind of what if spaces and facilitating really good what if spaces. I think we have to become really good at the art of asking really good what if questions. And there are various examples in the book, and I'm sure we might come onto those. There's great activities like Transition Town Anywhere, which is that exercise where you get between 100 and 400 people in a big space, lots of cardboard, string, sticky tape, pens, and you imagine you travel to a 2030 that's not utopia, but it's the result of us having done everything we possibly could. It's the result of the 9 years between now and then being a revolution of the imagination. You've just lived through a revolution of the imagination. Imagine yourself in that world. What are you doing in that world? And then we're going to build it literally with cardboard and string and sticky tape, and then live in it and trade in it and play in it. It's amazing. So a lot of those kind of activities that I try to collect and I use in courses to try and help people be more imaginative, help people to play. We need to get really good at practicing the difference between yes, but and yes, and. Because all of you as people who want to try and change things all the time will experience that you bring an idea and it gets met with yes, but, you know, well, it's too expensive, or we tried that before and it didn't work. And, you know, we have to have a culture of yes, and, like you do in improvisation, where someone brings an idea and then you build on it and build on it and build on it. And then the last thing we need, I think, is pacts. This idea of pacts that is I talk about in the book from Bologna. This idea that we need to, every organization that's able to support people needs to invite their imagination and then meet it in the middle and make pacts to actually say, yeah, we see your imagination, we meet it in the middle, we respect it, we're going to make that happen. Let's do it. Because all too often our experience of imagination is of it being sidelined and belittled and humiliated. One last thing I'd say on that is actually the first exercise that I do on any course that I run about imagination to help people free it up a little bit is that I put them into groups of 5 or 6 people. I give them 4 potatoes and a handful of cocktail sticks. And I say, I want you back here in 20 minutes with a creature. And I want to know its name. I want to know what it eats. And I want to know its mating cry. Go. And they go and they just giggle for about 20 minutes. You see them going around, a little bunch of people just giggling for 20 minutes. And then they come back with something totally ridiculous, because the beauty of it is, even for people who are complete perfectionists and who are really worried about play because they might get it wrong, you can't make anything sensible with potatoes. They're inherently ridiculous. And it takes us out of that space of being really terrified of getting it wrong. And it allows people to get into a space where they can play like they did when they were kids. So it's called Potato Monsters. I really recommend it.
Oh, brilliant. One of the chapters in your book that really caught my attention, from my personal interest, is what if we became better storytellers? What I believe is that this is where the real change will take place, is in changing the narrative, changing, the story about we tell ourselves about what it means to be human at this time of climate breakdown. And can you explain this idea within the context of the book for us?
The Swedish government recently hired a guy called Per Gronqvist to be he works for the Swedish government. His job title is Chief Storyteller. And his job description is to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a low-carbon future. I feel like every council should have someone do that. Every organization should have someone doing that. We should all have the capacity to do that. And the reason that storytelling, I feel, is so important is because we are not going to stimulate and bring about a revolution of the imagination and the scale of change that we need to see in the next 10 or 15 years just by giving people facts and figures and information. If that was going to have worked, we'd have done it and started in the 80s, and we've done it by now, and it would have been so much easier than doing it now. For me, the big work of now is to cultivate longing, is the cultivation of longing. I always say it's like the moon. Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon in 1969. It wasn't his idea to go to the moon. It wasn't JFK's idea in 1960 when he announced the Apollo program. We've been going to the moon for centuries, since Galileo said, actually, do you know what? It's a thing. You could actually go there. It's not like a sort of a disc painted on the ceiling or something. It's an actual round thing, and you could go there. We went there in stories and songs, and stories where we went up there on a big silver ladder, or we flew there on a bird. Jules Verne wrote his book about going to the moon, where they fired the astronauts there in a cannon. I don't think they quite thought through how they were supposed to get home again afterwards. I always had this vision of us just endlessly firing people off out of a cannon, assuming they all having a really great time on the moon. And actually, that really wasn't what happened to them. Tin went to the moon. Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon. By the time we got to 1960, the cultural collective longing to get to the moon was so intense that we did it in 9 years from scratch, and the average age of people who did it was 26. If we can cultivate the longing for this stuff, it becomes so much easier. And cultivating longing is the work of imagination, and it's the work of storytelling. And the poet Rilke once said something like, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." And the problem we have is that we're so brilliant at telling endless stories about our own demise, whether we are destroyed by aliens or zombies or gremlins or diseases or I don't know, whatever, I don't know, all the stuff that destroys us in films. We never tell the films about us seeing a great problem like that and actually coming together and sorting it out and doing it, and we need those stories. And so I often do activities with groups, just all sorts of playing, imaginative stories sort of stuff. One of the things that I do at the beginning of every talk actually is this sort of time machine exercise where I tell everybody I bought my time machine. I spent lockdown building a time machine, and that we're going to travel to 2030 in this thing, and then there's an imagination. We all travel to 2030, and I say it's not utopia, but it's the result of us doing everything we could. And I invite them to take a walk around in that world, and then tell their partner. They get into pairs and to share it with people. It's often quite a kind of a moving, really moving experience for people, actually, because often people who are activists spend all of their work trying to build a world that they never really pause to stop and try and imagine. In the podcast that I do, From What If to What Next, every episode has 2 guests and we explore a different what if question. And we start every episode like that. So if we're exploring a universal basic income, we don't say, would this be a good idea? I say, okay, imagine we've had a universal basic income since 2022. Walk us through that world. How is it different? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? And actually, one of the things I've been doing now that we've done 30-something episodes is to cut a lot of my favorite bits of those together. And we've done some bits then when we've worked with an animator to bring them to life, and we've worked with sort of people doing sound art and music using those bits, because it's so evocative as stories. People bringing that future to life in different ways, because, yeah, as I say, this is about longing and how we cultivate longing.
Excellent. Let's change subject a bit, and we'll take some questions soon. But I think it'd be really good to hear, Rob, about the transition movement and how, just briefly, how it got started, where you are today, where you see that going, and how it fits in with your work on imagination. Yeah,
so the transition movement started, depending on which version of its history you go with, either in Kinsale in Ireland or in Totnes in about 2005, 2006. And it really started as an experiment to see if it might work. If something might work in Totnes, that was really the question. What could we do? And it came from a really amazing sort of melting pot of different. I mean, I moved here from Ireland, and I'd been teaching permaculture, and then started meeting people who were interested in different things, and also met people who bought this kind of aspect of what we call inner transition, of saying it's not just about solar panels and carrots, it's about how we work together, and that the how matters as much as the what in terms of what we do, and that we aren't just replicating the same paradigm over again and creating organizations to try and build the new world with the same sort of power structures and things that we have before. So it kind of in September 2006 we did what we called the official unleashing of Transition Town Totnes, and there were already people there. I don't even know how they heard about it, from Lewis and Brixton, I think, and different Falmouth, different places, who then went back and got started, and very quickly it was just going nuts. People all over the place. What are you doing? How do you do it? We didn't even know how we were doing it. We were just making it up, really. And then we started Transition Network to try and support the movement as it grew. There are now transition groups in 50 countries around the world. There are 23 countries that have what we call a national hub. So they kind of they take on Transition Network's role in supporting transition in that country. What I love about it, we now talk about it as being a movement of communities that are reimagining and rebuilding the world. You can look at the transition movement through different lenses. You can look at it as being an economic development movement. You can look at it as being a sort of almost like a sort of a personal growth, sort of community type scale approach. I think also I look at it as being a really important sort of community what if imagining process. I love it. It's always really fascinating. We just did a big evaluation exercise, which we do every few years, to go back out to the movement and say, are you all still there? Is there still stuff happening? Tell us your stories, what's going on. And it was a phenomenal response, and really diverse, really eclectic, from towns in Japan who've created their own energy companies, and all sorts of urban food projects and really ambitious stuff now. Like in Belgium and places, there are some really dazzlingly ambitious things that people are doing, and the beauty of it is that it looks different everywhere. also kind of recognizable everywhere. And it's, for me, it was always really designed in such a way that what the role of Transition Network was just to be there to support self-organization. You know, it's not like we're not, it's not like a Coca-Cola franchise and you sign up to it and we tell you what to do, or the transition pops up in Brazil because we've opened an office in Brazil. It's like, it's been such a beautiful experiment to observe in terms of what it looks like when you trust self-organization. And I always tell a story about a few years ago, quite early on, actually, about 2009 or something. I was invited up to London by an organization that supports social entrepreneurs. They rang me up and said, "You are a social entrepreneur." I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And they said, "We'd like you to come to London and to be part, and to basically present to us. And then if we like what you do, we will support you in different ways." And so I gave this presentation, and then at the end of it, there was this long silence. And then somebody said, "So what you've done is to create a very powerful brand and give it away to people all over the world that you have no control over at all, and you have no control over them, and you don't make any money out of it." I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." And so there's that I like that sort of culture about it.
Yeah. What sort of 15 years on, Rob, what have been your main lessons or insights that you've had, and maybe something that's very different to how you imagined it would be?
Well, I mean, the fact that it still exists, I think, is extra. I mean, you know, there's so many things like Occupy and things that are like a sort of souffle. They sort of come with a big sort of woof, and then they sort of go again. And I think the transition movement has been quite skillful at putting foundations under that. You know, it could have been something that just came and went, but actually, I think that side of it we've done quite well. I love the fact that it's always really surprising, because like, if you're a control freak, starting something like Transition would just be horrendous, because you have no, it's not like you have any control over it at all. You're just trying to give it support and say, how are you doing? You know, I think, going back to your question about storytelling, I think in many ways I think of it as it's a network of story.
Interesting.
You say, like, all the resources are free, all the tools. You don't pay an annual membership to be a transition group. You don't pay for the webinars and the things that we put on, all the resources that we create. Everything is free. There's just one condition, which is that you share your stories. That's how we learn. That's how this stuff spreads and grows. You know, we started. One of the first things that we did in Totnes, which I think, you know, if people know nothing about Totnes, they know that we printed our own money. You know, we started with Totnes Pound. I walked into a building on the high street in Totnes. There was a framed 1810 banknote issued by the Bank of Totnes in 1810. I was like, wow, was that really? The town had its own bank and they printed their own money. What would happen if we made some new ones? And we started this advisory panel of kind of learned alternative economists. And we said to them, what would happen if we just printed some new notes? They said, no idea. Try and see what happens. So as an advisory panel goes, that's a bit rubbish, really. You know, we thought we'd get a bit more advice. So we did, and we just printed 300 notes and had 3 months where it was kind of an experiment. And the shopkeeper said, this is fun. Can we do it again? And by the end, we ended up, we had a £21 note, and people would visit and say, why have you got a £21 note? And we would say, why not? What we like. And actually now, you know, and we stopped the Totnes Pound about 2 years ago. Just basically nobody used cash anymore. But that idea and that story of a town that printed its own money went everywhere. And you know, people would tell me, oh, I was on holiday in Mexico, and people say, where are you from? I'm from Totnes. You the Totnes Pound. And now you go to France, they've a different model, which is inspired by the Totnes Pound, because there was a film called Tomorrow or Demain, which some of you might have seen.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Huge, and it was massive in France in a way there's almost impossible here to imagine a climate change related film being so enormous. And it was seen it ran in mainstream cinemas for like 5 months, that film. And it was shown, and in it, I hold up my £21 note and I say, well, why not? Pourquoi pas? You know, and actually everywhere you go now in France, they have their own currency with a slightly tweaked model. which works much better. And they have, like, I've been to one place, they have a 13 note. Somewhere else I went to, they have a 49 notes. You know, there's this beautiful playfulness with it. In Liège in Belgium, they have a 0 note. I was like, why have you got a 0 note? They said, well, you know, sometimes someone does something nice for you and you want to say thank you, but you don't want to put a number on it because that kind of feels a bit sort of mercenary. You just want to give them something and say, yeah, cheers. It's a little token of my appreciation. You might want to hand it on to somebody else. So these 0 notes just get passed around as little sort of thank you tokens. And, you know, I couldn't have thought of that. And that's the beauty of it for me, is this sort of playfulness and this sense that it's okay to try something, and if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. You tried something, that's brilliant, well done, and just share what you learned from that.
Excellent. Well, let's take some questions from the audience now. Got a question here. How do you, Rob, ensure that you are not over busy trying to solve the problems and instead create the space for your own imagination?
That's a very good question. My wife just came in. She would say, "You're over busy." So yeah, I don't know that I'm necessarily the greatest model of it. What do I do? I draw. I think for me, in the first lockdown, you know, I went to art school when I was 18, and then started having family and working and doing transition every waking hour, and it's a part of me that never really got nourished. And it was a kind of a really conscious thing in the first lockdown. I was like, right, I'm going to make time and space, and I really tried to keep that. I tried to, you know, go outside kind of a couple of times a day. I tried to keep my work time quite kind of boundaried, I guess. And I always try to not do anything during August if I can. I don't know. It's really difficult because, you know, I actually, you know, I'm very involved in some campaigns here in Totnes, which all of a sudden become really, really fairly all consuming. But I read books, and also I guess as well, like, I'm really lucky to be part of some teams of people who committed to a different way of working together, where we try to look out for each other's, where we support each other's kind of creativity rather than shut it down. I guess maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. Or maybe writing a book about imagination is a good practice. There you go.
Yeah, well, actually, I think it was. And one of the things I did when I was researching it, based on the research I was doing, was I stopped having a smartphone for about a year and a half, and I just went to having a really crappy old Nokia thing, and that was great. But then I had a train journey where I was supposed to be going to Belgium, and all I had was my laptop and this rubbish phone. And the first train out of Totnes was late, which meant all my later trains were all knocked on, and so I had to rebook my tickets, but I couldn't. And then I couldn't get any Wi-Fi on the train on my computer. I was wandering around stations with my computer, and I was late for everything. And then I came home and I got a smartphone. But I also do try and make at least a day a week when I put that thing in a drawer, turn off all the notifications on it all the time, you know, to try and, because they're powerful things.
They are.
Manage it a bit.
Next question. Isn't the truth just so horrible that we can't bear to think about it, yet alone solve it? And I think that's been a recurrent theme in a lot of the talks we've seen, but, you know, it is a terrible situation, you know, and it is overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of the time, you know, I do sometimes, it's a sort of one of my worst habits. It's just occasionally I can't help getting into discussions with climate skeptics on social media, because I'm really interested in them. I really want to try and understand what makes them tick. And hang on, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, what was the question again?
The question is, it's so horrible what's happening. We can't.
Oh yeah.
About it.
And I think sometimes that denial is a form of is a way of sort of blocking it. It's too, I can't get my head around it, so I'm going to, it's not happening, you know. Yeah, I mean, I always say to people, if you're not terrified about the climate emergency, you're really not paying attention. But then also at the same time, I think, like Paul Hawkins says, if you've spent any time around the movements around the world that are trying to do something about it, and you don't feel a degree of optimism, then you don't have a heart. And it's those two things alongside each other for me.
Yeah.
It's like there's a kind of a healthy cycle, I think, of being with the grief and recognizing the grief of what's being lost. And when we look at what's happening into the oceans, and we look at what's happening in the in the up the northwest of America and Canada at the moment, and in Pakistan, and to not have time when it feels too late and too like I say, then you're not paying attention. But then at the same time, I feel like pessimism is a privilege that I don't have. And as a parent, I feel like yes, we are already locked into a degree of warming, but every fraction of a degree makes an enormous difference.
Oh, definitely.
And I feel like there are enough times in history when things have changed extraordinarily quickly. We saw during COVID this sort of myth that change can only happen in small incremental steps, really revealed as the complete nonsense that it always was. Yeah, actually, companies who make Formula One racing car engines can turn over to making ventilators within about 3 weeks. Craft breweries can start making hand sanitizer within a couple of weeks. You can run a successful business without flying all of your team to Paris once a month for a breakfast meeting. You can be a successful academic without delivering your paper at a conference in Rio de Janeiro, Tel Aviv, and Stockholm. Actually, we can rethink things. Give policy councils a policy to say nobody should be sleeping rough within a week, although then you don't give them any money to actually make it happen. But that spirit of we can develop things really quickly. We can move when we recognize it's an emergency. That if we are just paralyzed and think it's too late and nothing's possible, we're not going to get anywhere. And so for me, it is that thing of what I try to work with people is to say, yeah, it's really important to create that space in life to imagine that maybe it's too late, and that maybe, but also at the same time, it's really important that we allow ourselves to imagine that the next 10 or 15 years will be a time of the most unprecedented, phenomenal, extraordinary change that has ever happened. That this could be like living through a revolution of the imagination, and that is possible. We have the movements all over the world. We have the public interest is now holding public opinion that we need to do strong action on climate change is holding at above 80% in opinion polls for the first time in my life. We see the pressure coming from now, all the court cases happening everywhere. It is possible that we are close to a tipping point, that when we tell the story of how the climate emergency was addressed, we will look back at COVID as being a key change in direction. That stuff all feels entirely possible to me, but we have to hold on to that and tell the stories about it and what it would feel like to live through a time like that.
And I think also, whether it be a transition movement or greening stemming, overcoming climate anxiety and this feeling of overwhelm and despair is made so much easier by working with other people, by coming together collectively, so we can actually support each other through this. So it's not just about doing green work, it's almost psychological benefits of connection and mutuality and support. I think it's incredibly important. Another reason why I think transition movement is so critical. So another question here. Mary Portas is currently talking about the kindness culture in business, thinking about quality rather than growth. How does this fit with your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I always say to people that this idea that growth is the only metric by which we consider things to be successful is so peculiar. I'm a father, and I always think if my children, they're up to a certain age, the fact that they're bigger than they were the previous year is something that's a pretty good metric of success. You know, if as a parent your children are bigger than they were last year, that's kind of a good thing. But if they just kept on growing and growing till they were about 30 meters tall, you'd think after a certain point something's going really quite horribly wrong here. You know, you want your children to grow ideally to slightly shorter than you, and then to grow in different ways, you know, to become wiser and kinder and more skilled and more compassionate and stuff like that. We don't give the same the same kind of expectation for our economy. We just want it to be bigger every year. So I mean, I think she's right. But it's not just about quality. It's also about how do we build economies locally which add resilience, which celebrate that place. You know, it should be that there are things that I can come to Stenning, and there are flavors and tastes and experiences I can only have in Stenning that I wouldn't get anywhere else.
A rave.
You know, it's like, yeah, a rave. It's like, you know, one of the things I'm involved with down here is I started a brewery. We have a very successful brewery and tap room down here called the New Lion Brewery, which is one of the UK's first 100% community-owned breweries. And I love it. And that was kind of really inspired by this craft beer movement, where you'd go to a place and you could drink things that only came from there, rather than wherever you go in the world, you drink Budweiser and it tastes exactly the same. Actually, you should be able to celebrate what it is about that place. So I think she's right, but it's kind of more than that. It's about, yeah, resilience, things that are from that place. It's about using that as the opportunity to maximize the circulation of money within that economy. You know, I think just to focus on quality is kind of a bit shallower than the urgency of the times that we're in really demands.
Okay. What are some of the best ways of engaging the wider public in imagining a different future? Perhaps you could describe the process. You mentioned there's some tools you use, and perhaps what you're doing in transition at the moment.
I think I mean, there's different elements to that. I think firstly, we need the people who are actually kind of in charge of things to be honest with everybody. You know, we like what I think is so brilliant with Extinction Rebellion, starting with tell the truth. You know, we need to be telling the truth, and we need people in positions of power to actually be doing that, rather than somehow trying to maintain this nonsense that actually everything's fine. I guess what I try and do is to, you know, we at the moment it feels like the idea that the future could be something great or something so much better than what we have now becomes really obscured by the fact that all the stuff that's in front of us, like the challenges of now, and the social media is always there going, no, actually, you're all really different from each other, and you all hate each other, and oh, look what he said about you, and you get stuck with that. And the beauty of doing that time machine exercise for me is that it gets you beyond all of that. The way capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism, works is by basically selling you stuff that triggers dopamine: handbags, shoes, chocolate, sex, whatever it is, things that give short dopamine release, and then it's gone, and then you want some more. And when that's your economic model, which is about pleasure and selling people pleasure, you see a rise in depression and addiction in a society. And Robert Lustig's book, The Hacking of the American Mind, is brilliant on that. Really recommend it. And but when you do that time machine exercise, you know, I've done that with small groups, big groups. I've done it with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium. I've done it with in all sorts of different settings. And it's always the same. When you say to people, okay, tell me about what are your impressions of that future that you're kind of longing for. First thing people say, birdsong. The birdsong is so much louder, and the air smells great, and there's so many less cars, and there's not really many airplanes in the sky, and I'm doing work that feels really nourishing. And I feel really connected to the community around me, and you know, and actually we had that during the first lockdown. Not everybody, but a lot of people experienced it much more. So the beauty of that exercise is what it does is it allows you to connect into contentment and happiness. And capitalism can't sell you that; it sells you pleasure, which is a sort of pale imitation of that. And so what I do increasingly is work with organizations and work with communities to say we start there. We start there, and then we work back, because that's the common ground there. You know, it doesn't matter. You voted Leave or you voted Remain, whatever. Still want the bird song and the you know, and then we work backwards from that. And there's a beautiful story in the book that I tell about somebody I interviewed who told me about that they were working in America with an organization that supports the parents of incarcerated children. So in America, children as young as 11 can get sent to prison. And as parents, when the kids are in prison, you have very little rights to actually see them. So there's a group of parents who, you know, they're often very poor families, often from communities of color, and they'll travel like half the day on a bus to go and see their kids and arrive there and be told, sorry, you can't see them today, and then they'll have to come back. So the work they did with them was to say, okay, what does success look like for you? And they'd say, well, it would look like we get this bill passed in Congress. Okay, imagine that's been passed. Now what does success look like for you? Well, then this would have happened. Okay, that's happened. And they would take that process up to the point where they said, okay, so now what does success look like for you? And they would say, success smells like waffles being cooked. Because that's what family and what they're really longing for. And that's okay, we start there. So I've just done some work with a group in North Devon who manage water catchments, and we did that by working with an artist. So I would do this exercise with them, and then I would say to them, okay, so you've done your dreaming of 2030. Now I want you to think about what were the what if questions people asked in 2021 that meant that we got here. Yeah. What if questions people asked that unlocked this kind of scale of change. And then he would draw that, and he would do like drawings of the river catchment as if all of that had happened. So the arts and animation and working with illustrators is also a really important part of this, I think.
No, and it engages different parts of the brain as well, you know, which is another problem at the moment. Another question here, and I'm aware of the time, so we'll have a couple more. How do we bring together different imaginings so they connect rather than compete?
Well, I think partly by doing that time machine thing, you know, where you push the time frame out a little bit. If you say, you know, there's a kind of a sweet spot. If you say, okay, we're going to imagine it's in 2 years' time, people are like, oh, you know, you just get stuck in kind of, well, it's almost like the present, and we probably all still hate each other. And if you say it's 2080, then everybody just goes to kind of, you know, being under about 4 meters of water, and all the dystopias and the apocalypses come in. The beauty of 2030 or 2035 is that it's far enough away, you know, that we do have examples of incredible change happening in time periods like that. Yeah, so that would be the main thing, I think.
And got final question we just got here is, what have you noticed about climate skeptics? What do you think makes them tick? I don't come across many now, do you? I mean, genuine climate skeptics in this country?
There are less of them, and they've kind of morphed in quite often, all the kind of COVID skeptics and that whole kind of sort of pro-Trump conspiracy sort of space. You don't meet that many of them, but there are still some. It's kind of moved more to being like what does Michael Mann in the book that he wrote recently, The New Climate Wars. He's there about inactivists.
Yes, yeah.
And I think, you know, that they very much, it's this narrative of, well, come on, everybody, you know, let's take this, let's not rush into things here. And you know, a lot of it, I think, has now manifested into this kind of you know, I'm not for a moment like a massive advocate of electric cars, and you know, for me, I think we need alternatives to cars, not alternative cars. But it kind of it morphs into this thing of just trying to snipe at some of the things that we need to do in order to decarbonize the economy. I have a cousin in Australia who's quite a bit older than me, who is the most abhorrently right-wing, awful climate skeptic, and I sort of debated this stuff with him for about 2 years, and because I really wanted to get underneath it and kind of what made him tick, and I think it was that he really he felt like the world had sort of moved on and left him behind a little,
like Trump supporters, yeah,
and that he didn't really quite understand it, and that it gave him a sense of, it gave him a sort of kind of instant sense of kind of intellectual superiority without having to do any of the work. If you are Stephen Fry, you're kind of entitled to a sense of intellectual superiority. Really smart. My cousin's not Stephen Fry, but it gives him a kind of a sense of kind of an identity, and but it's like a club somehow. I find it really sad, actually, because I remember we got to a point where he said something like, what's the point of science? Like seriously say that, what's the point of science? Because all these climate scientists, they're all communists anyway. It's like,
let's get them on green books.
Really? You reckon people who just go out and just sort of measure CO2 concentration in the oceans are all communists? That's like why they signed up, It's like so.
The only rational explanation. Excellent. Yeah. So as we're coming to a close, Rob, we've got a lot of people here from different movements, transition, local movements, greening stunning, who are hosting it. What is there any advice or any final words of encouragement or advice you give to those of us who are involved in community change from all your experience?
I think the first thing that I would say is thank you for everything that you do, because it's not very often that people actually come along and say thank you. And I really, really want to celebrate what you all do. And I think it's really important in our groups that we celebrate. In the Dragon Dreaming model, it talks about you go through dreaming, planning, doing, and celebrating. And that should always be the cycle. And we tend to always leave out the celebrating bit, because you get to the end of it and then there's always more things to do. Celebrate, really, because it's so important in terms of managing burnout in our groups and in our movements, that we make space for celebration. I would say that I feel like in many ways the doors that 5 or 10 years ago were really closed are a lot more open than they might have been before. And also it feels really important to me that we, there's often an accusation that groups like this often tend to be kind of middle class white enclaves, and I feel like the bringing into the culture of what we do the idea that we need to be building new economies and creating and building a new economy where we're creating work for people. Like the brewery that I mentioned, we employ 12 people now. That's 12 people who can pay their mortgage and put food on the table at home. That's so important. And we could have just looked at it and said, we're going to do like a volunteer sort of community brewing thing. I was like, no. We've got to create work for people here. And I feel like we need to be stepping up and building the new economy, not being afraid of bringing that sort of culture and looking at projects in that kind of a way. And also, I would just say as well, to be kind to yourself, and that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and to really foster a culture in your groups, if you don't already, of being able to say to people, I think you're doing a bit much. You sent me an email at 2:00 in the morning. Is everything all right? We actually have that culture of care, that we meet and work together as people who care about each other, rather than just as people with an agenda to crack through and then all get on and do things.
Brilliant. Well, on behalf of everyone here, Rob, we'd like to say thank you very much, not just for appearing tonight, but for all your amazing work. You're truly an inspiration, and thank you ever so much. That was wonderful. And thank you. And so just to end, I'm just going to tell you, we're going to have a summer break. And then in October, we're going to have a talk from Henry Mance, who writes for Financial Times, about how to love animals and the incredible dissonance between the way we treat pets and how we claim to love animals and how we actually treat them in practice in farms and in industrialized farming. So that will be very interesting. We've also got some green drinks events, and you can find out on our Greening Stenning website, the different events we're doing over the summer. So thank you ever so much for everybody for attending, and thanks again to Rob. That was terrific. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm just putting into the chat, if anybody's interested in the podcast that I do, putting a link where you can find that. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.